after the delicious lunch. It's a really challenge. And to take up this challenge, we have with us very capable speaker, CA Ajit Viswanath. So friends, now before we go to next part, we have with us our regional council member, CA Ketan Sayya sir. Fortunately, there are very few representatives who can really know about audit or talk on audit, and Ketan Bhai is one of them, who is hardcore auditor, and definitely I would like that he give us a word of wisdom about the today's topic.
Thank you, Bipin Bhai. Friends, rest assured, I am not here to give any wisdom. We have a respected speaker in the form of Ajit ji, who is going to talk about audit documentation. And I think the key word is there on his first slide itself, that audit not documented is audit not done. I think NFRA session is over or is about to be there. I think that is the, where if we understand the importance of documents or dangerous of not having documents. Predominantly, for past several years, we have been telling that, this is most difficult task. Difficult in the sense it's a boring job. I will go and, love to do audit, but when it comes to documentation, I'm also getting tired. Ki yaar, kitna document jama karna hai? Looking at the current scenario, the expectation of government, the stakeholders, the regulatory body like NFRA, peer review, the FRRB review, I think I may be doing 10 audit, 20 audit, 30 audit, or maybe 60 tax audit. But when it comes to, presenting before a third person, it becomes very difficult. I am not going to, I may go and do a great ledger scrutiny, verification of stock, I may do, telling of various statutory requirement, balances, I may have my checklist. But if I don't maintain them in physical or soft form, which I am supposed to, beginning with, engagement letter or ending at management representation letter and the other deliverable given by the client, unless I do that, I myself know that I have done a wonderful audit. But I cannot tell others. And even if I go and tell others, I may not be able to tell after 3 years, 5 years, 7 years. That is where the documentation is must. I am told the big CA firm, including Big Four, are spending almost 40% or more than 40% of the time on the creation of document, be it soft, hard, in creation of all the evidences that I have carried out a proper audit. Whereas we all, including me, myself, we are not even spending 10% of the time. And the times have been changing. If we don't do at that point of time, maybe today if I have a peer review and I have not done in 3 years documentation, I'll have to sit for 3 months, 6 months, try and see my file, create checklist, look at that, which is in any ways, compulsion on me nowadays. If I don't do, peer review, next year I won't be getting bank audit. So especially people who are doing bank branch audit, all small and medium sized firms, many of them are getting that. If they don't do peer review this year, they will not get the audit next year. There will be one compulsory reply column wherein they are supposed to say whether the firm is peer reviewed or not. So now the time has changed. Earlier we were thinking we have an option, though it was not. But there was no practically third person asking and coming and seeing me. Now which is there, if nothing from NFRA or nothing from government body, at least peer reviewer will be there. Or if you have a listed entities, definitely you will have so many other agencies, including SEBI, to see whether actually the audit is carried out or not. And actually in terms of what you are able to justify. I'll just end with one example. The XYZ bank at Sakinaka, leading nationalized bank, Sakinaka branch, one firm audited. There was an account which was standard in March. June, the RBI inspection came under section 35. The account was classified as substandard by the RBI inspector. वहाँ तक ठीक है. The fallback was they gave a show cause to the auditor and said that if this was NPA on 31st March, why did you not classify it as NPA? A show cause is given to you. if you are not able to justify with the documents, we'll be filing a complaint in DC. In fact, based on the submission, they were not satisfied with the document which was submitted to them. They proceeded with filing a case in DC. Mind well, as many as 69 notices were there only in Mumbai city of RBI in last year, in March 23. March 24 का तो अभी होगा. So this is one more regulatory body which is now asking you to provide documents wherever your findings, with your finding they are not comfortable. This was one example. But NFRA तो हम देख ही रहे हैं कि kind of penalty. One more new development, if you would have seen, MCA Delhi levying penalty of 7 crore, including 1 crore penalties on independent directors. So I think that is also knocking our door, that MCA also might levy penalties, because they have also started review of financial statements. They have been doing for past few years. So shayad ab wo bhi hoga. So one, keep document after listening to the learned speaker. Second, have professional indemnity insurance, so that wherever there, whatever, financial loss which are there, even if I may do document, if I may do audit, but if my stand is not agreed by these regulators, be it NFRA, RBI, SEBI, whoever, then if they levy me the penalty, at least I have something to my rescue and I am able to save my skin. With this, happy learning to all of you, and thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. We have with us our next speaker for the day, Ajit Viswanathan, sir. Ajit Viswanath is a chartered accountant with more than 19 years of experience of working with clients on auditing and accounting engagements. He presently leads audits of entities in the financial service space, and also works with his organization technical team responsible for formulating positions for new development, consultation, etc. With this introduction, I request Ketan Sayya, sir, to give memento to our speaker. Yes, sir.
Thank you so much.
I request the speaker, sir, to take the charge.
Thank you, everyone. You can hear me at the back? Yeah. Okay. Like Ketan sir has very nicely summarized, this topic is really important for all of us as auditors in terms of many reasons why I think this becomes very critical. One, of course, is the whole aspect of regulatory reviews, which we see across sectors and across regulators, focusing on what documentation we have, focusing on what did we understand as auditors at that point, and of course review of our files in terms of what documentation it has. The other thing, which if all of you, some of you are a lot more experienced in terms of having been in the profession for a long time, traditionally auditors have always focused on accounting matters much more than auditing matters, right? For example, you would find a lot of detailed memos on accounting positions, detailed work papers talking about the accounting treatment followed by the company. But I think it's time for us to now reflect on some of the important auditing related or documentation related matters, right, which have to form part of our documentation, especially if our documentation is not based in is manually maintained or is just electronically maintained but not part of a software. It's very important that we are able to capture some of the important decisions which we took with reference to auditing standards, say materiality, say for example sampling, say how did you assess an error in terms of whether it is to be qualified or not qualified. All those also have to find its way into our documentation, because increasingly, as you are seeing and hearing, regulators also want to hear how did we conclude on specific matters, which of course later with hindsight have become very important matters. So therefore documentation assumes significant importance in terms of what we do as auditors. Actually, documentation is one of the key responsibilities of our work, right? Both for safeguarding our risk and also our responsibility to regulators and to the society at large. We also will focus on one more topic, which is communicating with those charged with governance, which is also one element of what we were supposed to cover, which is also an extremely important element. There's been a lot of focus by regulators on that as well, and we have some points. The way we will go through this is I will first cover some of the key concepts from the auditing standards, and then we will conclude with some key takeaways for you to consider, which based on practical application, what we see, which is important for all of us to consider as auditors. And if you have any questions, I did see in the previous sessions as well that all of you are very interactive and you have been participating. Please do that. It's always nice to have questions, especially after lunch. Doing a topic on documentation is while convener sir made it very positive, but it's a very tough session, so all participation would be really nice. Okay. So of course, what do we mean by audit documentation? It really means the working papers which we have on our file, right? Which is the record of our audit and which is extremely critical in terms of evidence obtained, in terms of conclusions reached. And this will range from starting the planning the audit, right? Remember, when you plan for the audit, when you do your risk assessment for the audit, even that has to be backed up by evidence. So quite often risk assessment is a document where you assess all the risks, right? But we've seen now regulators coming and asking, okay, what was the basis of this assessment? You got a budget from management, you got board minutes, you got external references. But then how did you ascertain that the information which you used for risk assessment is appropriate or not, right? Materiality, right, is a very common example. In some of the large audits which you must be doing, materiality is done well in advance of the year end, or at least in February, March, when the accounts are not finalized. Then if you're using budgeted numbers, what procedures did you perform relating to materiality or the budgeted numbers to ensure those are the right numbers to follow or right numbers to use for materiality computation? Therefore, that also becomes an important element. So when we say documentation, quite often the first thing which comes to our mind are working papers which we have used to do substantive testing or test of details of the actual numbers. But remember, a very important element of documentation is also the work we do around planning, control testing, right? And walkthroughs, design and implementation. All of that forms part of our documentation. And everything is critical. There is no one element which stands out that this documentation is more than the other. Quite often, it's all linked, as you are aware. If I do my planning right, I would do my risk assessment. Risk assessment will give me significant risks of error, significant risks of fraud. That in turn would determine where I would do more work, where I have to do more sampling, what is my focus area, what do I need to communicate to those charged with governance. And then finally, my substantive work papers, I need to then draw conclusions on whether those numbers are appropriate. And then finally, the closure of the audit in terms of deliverables and all of that. All of these assume equal importance without any one item being more important. And like we've been saying, this is essential for audit quality. It is evidence of the auditor's basis of conclusions. This is our job, right? And this is a challenge which I'm sure all of you are facing, is that some of our junior team members don't enjoy documentation. But the reality is that what we do for living as auditors is really documentation. It is the core of what we do. It's not like sir called out that we do go and do a ledger scrutiny, or we do a variance analysis, or we do some meetings and then conclude, right? But all of that has to be backed up by documentation. Just having the ledger, for example, if I did a ledger scrutiny, just having the ledger on the file is not sufficient. We need to have the ledger on the file. We need to document what did we do as part of the scrutiny, what items we picked up, what did we discuss, how did we conclude. That is an example of how we need to have our documentation in place. And of course, the documentation is an important element for planning the audit. It facilitates supervision and review of the audit work. Because remember, a very important element is that quite often the partner who's signing the audit report may not be doing all the work on the ground. They may be assisted by 2 or 3 colleagues who may be working on the audit, or even more in some cases. Now, unless you have a documentation of what the colleague has done, how do you demonstrate that the partner has reviewed the work, right? And also, the evidence of review is also quite often in the documentation itself. If, for example, you maintain it manually, you take a printout and sign off that this has been reviewed on so and so date and it's signed off by the partner. Or if it's maintained in soft copy, then you have other ways of doing it. But a very important element of what we do, the whole structure of how we do audits, is the way it's set up, is that one person cannot do the work, right? In today's scale of operations of most of our clients, even the MSME ones are very large enough for one person not being able to do it. And people who sign audit reports are people who are doing multiple audits. So therefore, they are not expected to spend as much time. So there is a delegation of responsibility. But the ultimate responsibility lies with the, ultimate responsibility lies with the partner signing the opinion. And therefore, one of the important elements which regulators also look at when they come and inspect files is, did the reviews happen properly? Not only the signing partner, but the concurring partner or the second partner who is the who's kind of working with the engagement partner and providing views and reviewing the work done, even evidence of their involvement, right? And not only involvement, timely involvement. That is the one area of focus. If, for example, the engagement partner has signed off everything one day before signing the audit report, that is not considered as timely involvement in today's world. It is required to be spread out. It is required to begin right at the time of risk assessment. It is required to be in continuous involvement rather than an involvement at the end which focuses only on the issues and focuses on resolving those issues, which may be identified by the team. Regulators in these instances come and ask, how do you know you did not have more issues? If you had been involved on a more timely and proactive basis, there could have been more issues which you could have identified. So therefore, while this facilitates supervision and review of audit work, but the crux is that we have to do it on a timely basis. We have to get it done in a manner which demonstrates timely and adequate involvement of the people involved, especially of the partners who are signing the audit report. And remember, while this concept is losing its importance with soft copy files, permanent audit file is also a very important element which we used to maintain manually, right? But it's important for us to focus on permanent audit files as well, because there is the repository of some of the important documents which you have been taking over a period of time. And that also is part of our work papers. That also is part of our documentation. So permanent audit file and current audit file. Current audit file still, of course, we focus, but I think over time the focus on permanent audit file has diluted a bit, especially when you've moved to a soft copy form of documentation. So therefore, how do you archive your permanent audit file and how do you keep it in an area where it cannot be modified, it cannot be deleted, access is restricted? Some of those things in a soft environment or in a electronic environment is a very important element for us to consider. So that's also an important element of audit documentation. And of course, our job as auditors is to conduct an audit in accordance with auditing standards, which is now part of the Companies Act, and all other regulatory requirements which come in, right? Which includes CARO, which includes other elements of Companies Act. There are NFRA orders now, ICI guidance notes. The documentation forms the basis of our work, right? For us to demonstrate that we have complied with all of this, we only have our documentation to hang our coat on. So therefore, the importance of this cannot be overemphasized. I'll pause here. Any questions? Anyone has any point to make? Absolutely, absolutely. I think the point he is making is that how do we retain our work papers for prior audits, because we are required to maintain the work papers for a certain period under Companies Act, and even beyond that it's encouraged that we retain our work papers. And how do we do that, right? Especially if it's manual work papers, in some ways it's simple, ironically, that you can keep it in one storeroom or in a cupboard and it's all there. Now in a virtual environment or an electronic environment, especially if we do not have advanced softwares where archival is not there, we have to be extremely careful about how we maintain our work papers. Is it organized in a meaningful way? 3 years from now, if someone else or the people who have done the audit have moved on and only the partner is there in the firm, and a regulator comes and asks for information, will you be able to retrieve information in a manner which is timely? Lamya covered NFRA orders, some of the cases where NFRA has called out that there was no response from the firm. Now, it may be very well possible that they could not respond because they were not able to retrieve the information. They may have procured it, but it was not archived in a methodical manner, organized manner. So therefore, it's very important where we do not have a structured software to archive. We invest in a process and spend time thinking about the process of archival of information, because our work is the entire work which we do relies and depends on the documentation which we maintain. If we don't have documentation, we've seen now NFRA saying you've not done the work, which is how externally also in other jurisdictions we see, but it's much more relatable for us in the recent past. So therefore it's extremely important. Very valid point, sir. Anyone else has anything? Okay, we'll move on. In terms of form, content and extent, we've been speaking about it. It can be paper, it can be electronic. But again, I will reiterate, when it's electronic and you're maintaining in folders, for example, and you have a folder for, say, audit of X Limited, within that you have risk assessment, within that you have, it's very difficult for you to track and maintain the details. How do you know whether everything is filled or not? How do you restrict access? Because if someone goes inadvertently and deletes something, you wouldn't know. So there are ways in which even in your Microsoft folder, Microsoft Office, you can limit access to certain folders. There are ways in which you could track changes, what has been deleted, etc. But it's important for someone to apply their mind in terms of the process, etc. before you kind of go on. So therefore, that's also a very important element of documentation. While it sounds procedural, sounds mechanical, but for us, where we do not have a technological solution for archival of documents, that element becomes very important. Content, of course, it has to be detailed enough for an unrelated third party to be reading it and get an understanding of the work done and conclusions drawn and the basis of conclusions drawn. So that also has to be lucid enough for you to capture those information. Extent. The extent of documentation would depend on the complexity, right? Which is where I spoke of risk assessment. If it's in a complex area, the extent of documentation is expected to be much more. If it's a simple area, it's expected to be much less. It would depend on the level of complexity, right? These items I've spoken of, we can move on, right? One important element of documentation which has been focus of regulators across jurisdictions is the assembly of the final audit file. So what do I mean by that? Say now you've been doing work over a period of 2 or 3 months, you've collated information, you have obtained evidence, and now you're about to sign off, right? Now, once you have signed off on the audit report, as per the auditing standards, you are not permitted to obtain any new evidence which you should have obtained before. You are not permitted to complete your reviews after sign off of the audit report. Now, in whichever manner you maintain your documentation, you need to demonstrate, or you need to be able to demonstrate to an external regulator and to yourselves as well, that no work or either obtaining evidence, either discussions with management, reviews, internal reviews, etc., nothing has been done after the sign off of the audit report. What you are permitted to do is, if you obtained a representation letter but did not put it in the file, it was already signed, that is permitted, right? Because that comes in last minute. If you are reorganizing your file in a manner, all the evidence is there, you're just changing the location of the document, that is fine. But beyond that, very little change is permitted in your audit file after you have signed off on the audit report. This has been a focus area for regulators from other jurisdictions, like PCAOB has also been focusing on, and NFRA has also been focusing on this as part of their reviews also, as to why any change, forget why any change has been made. They're saying why any change is permitted to be made. So they are more focused on the process. They are focused on whether we as practitioners have set up processes that no change can be made after the sign off of audit report, or if any change is made, can you track it? If you are not able to track it, that itself is seen as a deficiency. They don't wait to see whether you have made any change. They wait to see, do you have a process to track if any change has been made post the sign off date. So that's an area, again, we must be extremely careful. We must try and focus on obtaining evidence before sign off. We must focus on completing our documentation before sign off. We must focus on completing our reviews before sign off. It is important that we plan our audit in that manner, and we are also clear with our companies which we audit that we will have to complete our processes before we actually sign off on the audit report. If you set the expectations right, I know sometimes it's difficult with companies when you deal with them, but the best you could do is set the expectations right and try and get as much done before you sign off on the audit report. And some of these elements around organization, sections, indexing, cross-referencing, of course, is an important element. Okay. Any questions before I move on? The risk assessment, what we meant was that you would need to perform a risk assessment before you can determine the scope, how you will proceed with the audit, where you will look at the entity level risks, what are the risks related to the industry, what are the risks related to the entity, has there been any recent development which would impact. For example, have you heard of the chip company NVIDIA, right? The company whose market capitalization is the highest in the world. Right now they are under extreme pressure to come up with results which are meeting market expectations, right? They are under pressure to be the most valuable company in the world. Now, if you were the auditor of NVIDIA, one of the elements of risk assessment which you would consider is this pressure. So there is a natural pressure on management to keep up this level of growth. There's a natural pressure on management to keep up this level of profitability. Anything which goes below expectation of market will mean the share price will go down, and it will mean billions of dollars lose in value loss, right? So therefore, those are the examples of what you would consider in risk assessment. And then of course you would determine specific caption level risk. Is there a significant risk of fraud, that revenue will be overstated? Is there significant risk of error on something? So those are the elements which you would need to consider before you conclude that what are the areas of risk. And the documentation around that risk assessment is also extremely important. Today the regulator, especially NFRA, wants to know what did you do in your risk assessment, right? If you read, Lamya spoke of the DHFL related reports. They spoke of the fact that even after the joint auditor resigned, there was no revision of risk assessment by the other continuing auditor. Those are the kind of things, and they want to see documentation. Okay, this event happened. How did you assess the risk? What did you look at? What were the factors you considered, and how did you conclude on those? So therefore, it becomes very critical for you to think about it. Any other questions from anyone else? Huh.
Just a reflection on the time allowed in the standard by the regulators, 60 days for the assembly of files. I personally feel it's too much.
Yes.
And what can be done in those 60 days again, the knowledge, what can be done, cannot be done, could vary across the practice.
Exactly.
So, any best practices, anything that you would suggest?
Yeah. So the best practice actually is to stop documentation on day 0. That's the ideal outcome. It's a very difficult task. It's very difficult to achieve in practice. So I would say 7 to 14 days is more logical and practical. But all said and done, whatever the period we take, after sign off of the audit report, we can't make any meaningful change to the file. I think we have to have that mindset. We can't even, I think one of the things which we allow in the Indian context historically is that financial statement disclosures get signed off later or get prepared later and we sign off. That is also not permitted actually. So therefore a lot of work has to happen with our clients to educate them, saying that our regulator is coming and challenging us on this. So therefore you need to be more prepared on items like disclosures, providing us with evidence, etc. well in advance, so that we are able to complete our audit well in time, so, and not face this challenge of assembly of audit report. You are right, the auditing standard does use 60 days, but it was written at a time when it was not an area of focus. Right now, globally also, people want to crunch it more and more so that you are not able to make any change at all. Because the point of view is that if you can't make any meaningful change, what's the point of keeping it open at all? Because then people make changes and they say I've made grammatical changes and so on, which is a problem.
In fact, on that one, you mentioned that there is an expectation of track change.
Exactly, exactly.
It can become very onerous.
Yes, and even across, even in the organizations I have worked with, we've seen instances where people make a lot of changes, historically at least. Now the focus has been much more. Then you would see that grammatical change and so on, which is not meaningful at all. So then you don't need those changes, because then someone could very well come and question that why did you need to make grammatical changes in the first place? Who would hold you accountable for grammatical changes? So therefore I think now we are, over the past few years, we've been in a situation where we say no changes and only critical changes, and you please document specifically, don't make general comments. What are the changes you are making? And I think that's the level which we have to hold ourselves accountable to, and certainly the regulator expects us to hold us accountable to.
One of the practical challenges is that when you're dealing with complex judgments, taking your sort of critical matters, etc., sometimes you run out of time.
Yeah.
And when you may have thought through it, you may not have done that fine tuning of the document.
Yeah.
So that's a practical challenge.
Yeah.
One has obviously need to plan and work accordingly
Yeah.
to avoid that pitfall. But that's a big pitfall.
It's a big pitfall, and actually my reflection on this is that when we as auditors, as chartered accountants, embark on an audit, one of the big areas for us to be focused on is project management. Like, are we able to look at an audit as a project and plan for it properly? Which is why I think if you look at the auditing standards and focus of regulators also, they quite often, and internationally as well, quite often they focus on planning much more than on substantive, much more than on actual vouching and all of that. They don't consider vouching as an most important element of audit. They always focus on planning, risk assessment as the most critical elements of the audit. That is not without logic, right? Because if you get your planning and risk assessment done on a timely basis, and you are able to foresee what are the critical areas and complex areas, it is more likely that you will be able to solve for it, address for it in a much more meaningful way, rather than if you did risk assessment 1 week before closure of audit, it is most likely that you would not have picked everything, or if you picked something, you would not be able to complete. I think historically the focus on assembly of file has not been there as much. So we were okay if, for example, we got number comfort and we got the evidence later, sometimes on trust, sometimes otherwise. But now clearly the regulator does not expect that. So once the time has been cut, saying that you have to stop your work on the date of sign off, we automatically have to focus on our planning and risk assessment, otherwise we will never be able to achieve that. Or else our documentation will be inadequate to support the opinion.
Robust project management is absolutely necessary.
Correct.
Especially because the level of maturity on the preparer side
Yes.
is different.
Yeah, varies. And also level of maturity of the teams doing the work, right? Of our teams. Because quite often if we are able to plan for the important pieces of work in advance, the level of oversight partners can provide who are signing the audit report will be much more qualitative and will be much more timely. And I think therefore it's very important that the planning and risk assessment happens on a timely basis, it's reviewed on a timely basis, and like we said, if it's not documented, it's not done. So therefore, everything has to be evidenced, both the documentation and our reviews also. Footprint, it could be manual sign off, whatever it is. I don't think we are focused on how we document. The standard allows us to do it manually also. But even if we do it manually, it has to be signed off and evidenced. Now, increasingly, the regulator comes and questions, how do I know you did not sign off on that day? Or how did you not backdate? So we need to have some mechanism to that, but we need to have documentation of timely reviews also. Okay. Yeah. So I put together a set of points which I thought was relevant and practical for all of us to consider, having covered some of these basic concepts. Like I said, documentation is at the heart of what we do as auditors. Audit means 90% documentation or 100% documentation. Everything we do has to be documented. So therefore, you may have various things which you do. You may do planning, you may do risk assessment, you may do analytical, you may do meetings. Whatever you do has to have documentation. So therefore, it's almost there throughout. So I don't think you can distinguish between audit and documentation. You can't say I will do the audit and let me do the documentation later. I think it goes hand in hand. So therefore, there is a very pressing need for us to, as a profession, see both together. When I say audit has been done, it means documentation has been done. Otherwise, audit is not done.
One of the things that one has to be extremely careful about, while documentation is critical and important, that should not compromise the professional skepticism.
Absolutely, absolutely,
People that keep the checklist mentality,
absolutely,
especially the less experienced people.
absolutely.
And they just stop thinking.
Yeah. But equally, that cannot be a reason for not documenting.
I totally agree.
Right.
Totally agree. It has to go hand in hand.
Exactly.
Which is again a function of our supervision there.
Exactly. And how the message from the top flows in terms of the partner signing the audit report, he or she also has to equally emphasize that I would want you to document on a real-time basis. I would want to review on a timely basis, and therefore things have to flow on a timely basis, right? And while our role is to obtain evidence for our opinion, maintaining evidence for what we have done is key, right? Like we spoke of archival as a point. This evidence is what will save us from any regulatory action in the future. This evidence will also hold us in good stead if there is any challenge or issue in the company. So therefore, audit evidence is not only the core of what we do, it is essential for our existence as a professional in context of the current regulatory environment. We do see significant corporate challenges as time progresses. We do see regulatory action on those corporates or questioning the auditors, and therefore, and like some of us have spoke, and even Ketan sir spoke, that their regulators call for documentation. I know of instances where SFIO would reach out to us as auditors and say, give us information, fraud has happened here. They may not question us, but they expect auditors to be the source of documentation when the promoter has run away, for example, right? So there is, what we do is of immense importance to the capital markets, to the regulatory environment, and therefore documentation is at the heart of what we do.
Of course, I think you mentioned that the documentation not only has to be sufficient, appropriate, but should meet the re-performance standards.
Exactly, exactly.
So that's where the importance of documentation comes in.
Absolutely, absolutely. The other thing which I would like to kind of talk about is that documentation is just not obtaining supporting contracts, invoices. A lot of the documentation, actually majority of the documentation in our files is much more than supporting documents and evidences. For example, one of the most important elements of our audit is how did we determine materiality. There has to be a detailed document around how did we determine materiality. What were the factors we considered? What was the benchmark? What choices did we have for that benchmark? Why did we choose one particular benchmark? Did it change from the previous year, or is it consistent from the previous year? Then what proportion of the benchmark did we take for determining our basic materiality, right? How did we arrive at that proportion? What were the factors we considered? All of this needs to be documented. This has got nothing to do with supporting documents, right? Risk assessment, like we spoke in details, you need to capture industry trends, you need to capture company related developments, you need to capture other regulatory actions if there is any, you need to capture news items, news articles around the company. So there are a whole set of items which do not qualify as supporting documents, but extremely important elements of documentation. Again, conventionally, we always when we think of audit documentation, we think of supporting documents and so on. So ideally, we should think beyond. Like I called out, accounting memos is very common in our audit files. But do we have memos for important auditing judgments? Right? Many of our audit steps involve judgments and decisions which we take around what we do in our audits. Whether we are able to capture the decision, basis of the decision, what auditing standard did I refer to, what were my considerations to arrive at that decision in a memo. I think that is much more important than having our own accounting memo. Quite often management would also prepare accounting memos. If you are satisfied, you can just keep that, because it is the management's responsibility to prepare financials. But if you do not have a memo or a paper on important auditing decisions which you took, that is the core of what we do, right? So therefore that's an extremely important element as well, right? One area where I think I find our many, at least the ones which I have seen, documentation being lacking, is we do extremely critical meetings where we get extremely critical information, right? It forms basis of our risk assessment, it forms basis of our interactions. Quite often communication with TCWG also, those charged with governance, are meetings. We do meetings to obtain information from business teams. We do meetings with CFOs, CEOs, MDs. But the level of documentation we have around meetings is generally very sketchy, right? Again, this is an area where regulators have come through and asked, okay, you did a meeting, but how do I know you discussed this at the meeting, right? So therefore, are you able to, are you capturing the discussions which you had in these meetings in the form of minutes? Do you send an email to the other person saying this is what we discussed? Are you able to capture that properly is also an important element of our audit documentation. Again, a very neglected area of audit documentation, but an extremely critical area, because many of our decisions, for example, you found an issue, right? Issue while you were conducting the audit. You went and discussed with the CFO. The CFO provided a resolution. Now, you may in the resolution say we discussed with the CFO and this is now resolved, right? But that will not stand the test of a regulatory review. What is extremely important is you capture the minutes of the meeting, you capture what was discussed, you capture what they provided as explanation, why that is acceptable, and cross-refer to that document in this resolution file, where you can then say this was discussed in the meeting, and that captures it. Whatever we discuss in meetings, and we always derive a lot of information from those, derive a lot of comfort. If it's not minuted, then the regulator is not willing to accept those as evidence, right? So therefore, that is also an important and extremely critical area where I feel that we must scale up in terms of our documentation for meeting minutes.
Does MR serve that purpose of like minuting?
Sorry?
In MR, the management use that to carry for this, or do we know this? The purpose of minutes?
Well, I would cover it in two parts. See, quite often when you are talking of management representation, it would maybe solve for certain situations or issues, right? But the meetings we do are much beyond issues. They are around understanding the performance of the company. They are around getting an understanding of the issues. Quite often you may resolve an issue and you may not feel the need to take an MR also. And the MR will typically be very brief, right? It will represent facts. The MR will not give you opinion, but the forming of judgment will consider the fact, apply some standards or regular requirements, and then you will conclude. So therefore, capturing it in the meeting minutes is also an important element over and above the management representation, right? Yeah. Yeah, Ideally, of course, it is better that it is sent across and it is agreed, because the regulator does expect that how do I know that you discussed this in that meeting. But at a bare minimum, we should have the minutes prepared very quickly, close to the date, right? Again, one area where regulators have come back hard is saying that you did a meeting in the month of September 2023, for example. You prepared the minutes on 5th April or 10th May 2024, 2 days before you signed off on this. How do I even give any credibility to this document which was prepared 6 months later? How do I know you just did not prepare the minutes based on the conclusion? So therefore, of course, the legitimacy of the document is best established by sharing that document with the counterparty who you met. But if not that, at least if it's prepared on a contemporaneous basis, you're able to evidence that this was reviewed on that day. That's the next best thing which you could have. And then you are able to capture it in some form in your communication with those charged with governance, etc. Then at least it is a credible way of maintaining that. The next point is, while it's a very basic thing, but I cannot overemphasize again, is the basic hygiene of documentation, right? Around not having duplicate work papers, not having semi-finished work paper in a which is not complete, not having within the work paper in an Excel file comments which are hidden, which could be damaging later because you did not, you may have resolved it. But if you think from the perspective of a third person who is reviewing the file, it just creates more doubt in their mind. Oh, this was also the case, right? Not having very random colored cells without any explanation. Ensuring that the numbers in your work papers tie up with the final accounts which were signed. Those are, while very basic, but those are the first things which regulators look at when they open a working paper. So therefore, and if they see that it's not, the basic hygiene is not there, they are not prepared to look at it any further. So therefore, again, those are very basic things, but it is required that as partners or proprietors who are signing off on audit reports, we are able to communicate the importance of this to our teams. Because unless we do that, they are not likely to follow the basic hygiene. Quite often we see, practically what we see is that teams say we will do the formatting and basic hygiene later, which becomes a humongous exercise at the end of an audit, right? So it has to happen on a real-time basis. It has to be an area of focus also, because that is also as critical as whatever else I have spoken of in context of the regulatory environment and so on. The other area where documentation quite often is very weak is the audit of the disclosures themselves, right? The financial statements is obviously the most important deliverable along with our audit report. A lot of disclosures go into the financial statements which are not very simple, which are not directly derived. There may be complex computations, there may be judgments. For example, on segment reporting, there's a judgment on CODM, who's the CODM, how did I arrive at the segments. In financial instruments disclosures, you have linkages across in the risk management schedule, forex risk, etc. How adequate is the documentation around financial statement disclosure is a question we should ask ourselves, right? We have extensive working papers around the numbers on the financial statement caption, but quite often we do not focus, or while we may have done the work, but the documentation around the work we have done for financial statement disclosure is an area which we don't necessarily focus on, or at least I feel is an area we could do better. That's also an important call out to my mind. Use of checklists. We are responsible for ensuring compliance with multiple regulations. We are responsible for ensuring compliance with first auditing standards. We are responsible for ensuring compliance with then accounting standards in context of the financial statements of the client, including on disclosures. We are responsible for ensuring compliance with Companies Act. We are, in some situations, we are required to ensure compliance with SEBI regulations. How do you document that you have ensured all of this, right? It's practically impossible unless you have a checklist. The institute also comes out with certain checklists. There may be some other checklists which are available in public domain. I think the first thing we have to do is ensure that we are picking up the latest one. We are not picking a dated one. If it's a dated one, we are capturing the changes which have happened after that checklist was issued. and we use that checklist to document our work done around those regulations, right? The basic thing is the auditing standard checklist. Of course, that's again an important element to ensure that the audit was conducted as per auditing standards. And the regulator looks at the auditing standard like law. Lamya may have covered, the NFRA came out with a circular saying wherever the auditing standard says shall, it means you must do, right? You cannot get away from doing not doing anything which the auditing standard requires you to do. Quite often we do it either by memory, or we may have some other checklist, but it's important for us to have oversight on auditing standards and how we've complied with it. So therefore, checklists are an important element of our documentation. We need to focus on that and get that right as well. And like I said, modification of work papers post the sign-off date is an important area of focus. We should not be modifying work papers at all after the sign-off date. Again, any questions? I'll pause. Anyone? Okay. Okay, so with this we come to an end to the session on documentation. We'll move on to communication with those charged with governance. I think the first...
Minutes of the meeting.
Huh.
There's always this question of to what level of detail can you possibly record.
Yeah.
So, do you just cover what you feel will be important later on when it comes to a review from a statutory perspective? You just briefly record it was discussed, it was agreed, that's it. And then you wrap up in one A4 page. Is this adequate?
Actually, I would not apply a lens on what someone else would expect. The lens I would rather apply is what was the judgment or what was the discussion I had, which translated into the judgment I finally formed. I would focus on the important matters which we would have discussed in that meeting and capture that in appropriate level of details. To just say this matter was discussed may not be sufficient. It depends on context also. But if, for example, say this is a discussion on key matters which you identified during the audit and its resolution, for example, there I would expect that the documentation is much more, meeting minutes are prepared in much more details in terms of the explanations which we received, in terms of how we responded to those explanations, and then the conclusion which was drawn. If it was, for example, say a risk assessment meeting and one of the items was a press release and they were not very relevant, maybe you could have a more briefer minutes. But I think the important lens I would apply is how relevant was this discussion for my auditing decision, either relating to planning, risk assessment, or substantive test or deliverable. Yeah. Okay, anyone else has any question? Okay. Yeah, on communication with those charged with governance, one of the important things which obviously has been picked up by NFRA, I don't know if Lamya spoke about this as well, is who is those charged with governance, right? That's an area where historically, at least in the context of listed entities, general perception was audit committees, those charged with governance. But if you look at the auditing standard also, the auditing standard says those charged with governance typically includes the board of directors and audit committees. So therefore, our responsibility is not only to those charged with governance or not only to audit committees, but also to other members of the board. It could be also senior management. For example, if a CEO is responsible for governance of the entity, then he or she is also part of those charged with governance. So therefore, the first important element is whatever we discuss for those charged with governance is not only applicable to an audit committee, it is applicable to the board, it is applicable to other senior members of management who are part of the governance mechanism. And this was called out by NFRA as well as part of their report in a couple of instances, that the audit firm concerned did not focus on all members of those charged with governance. So this is an extremely important element which we should be mindful of. the other thing is, of course, when we say those charged with governance, they have an important role in context of the company. The important thing is, it is their responsibility for maintaining governance. It is their responsibility for ensuring compliance with accounting standards. It is their responsibility for ensuring compliance with laws and regulations. And therefore, I think our role as auditors is also to keep them informed of any matters which requires their attention in context of their responsibilities. And that's the crux of how we approach communication with those charged with governance, right? And of course, from our perspective, we need to have effective communication with those charged with governance, because clear communication helps ensures transparency and builds trust, and it helps TCWG make informed decisions. It's extremely critical in that context. One of the challenges in communicating with those charged with governance, typically if you think of a board, right, they will have different members, not everyone from a finance background. They may be having business background, some may have regulatory background, some may have finance background, and quite often the matters which we would like to pick up with those charged with governance are not really their subject matter area. So you may have an engineer who may have done an MBA be on the board. He or she may have never dealt with accounting as a concept. But here you are trying to explain expected credit loss was not done properly by the management, or we have a difference of opinion in expected credit loss. LGD was not done properly, and it may all be very foreign for someone on the board who does not have accounting background. Even if someone had an accounting background and had been practicing accounting in the past and not been in touch with recent developments, he or she would find it very difficult to follow that trail of conversation. So therefore, one of the important elements of those communicating with those charged with governance is how can you break it down into very simple and easy to understand manner, right? And that's the very difficult task. For you to take a very complex matter which you have been fighting with management for several days, it's a very complex matter. It's a high area of high judgment. You are not able to arrive any view. You want their views because they are responsible, and you are going to them in the month of January to speak to them, saying that, can you please provide your views? We need to take a decision. What are your views? And for them to arrive at a decision, first they need to understand the matter, right? And how will you bring that whole complex matter into a simple manner so that they get the crux of it and are able to decide? That is a very, very difficult task, right? And very often underestimated in terms of how you end up doing it. So therefore, that is I would say is extremely critical in terms of even demonstrating to regulators as to how we have communicated this matter to those charged with governance. And of course, being clear in terms of progress of audit, they are also responsible to provide you with all information. So if you have any challenges in getting information from the management, you have recourse to those charged with governance. Those are also important elements which you need to consider for communication. Right. Again, similar to documentation, I have a few points to talk about from a communication with those charged with governance perspective. You know, often when we say those charged with governance, we think about listed company, we think of audit committee. But like I said, those charged with governance is not only audit committee, it's also board. It's also equally important from a unlisted company standpoint that we are able to communicate frequently with those charged with governance and are able to document our communications. So it's not a concept which applies to listed entities alone. It also equally applies to unlisted entities as well. So that's an important element for us to remember, that our files in terms of documentation has to capture our communication with those charged with governance, not only for listed entities, but also for unlisted entities. And of course, we have to have in our file some basic analysis of who are forming part of those charged with governance and how have we managed their communication. So which is the second point on identification. Like I said, this has been picked up by regulators. We need to be extremely careful on our assessment of who all are covered within those charged with governance. The third thing which has been a regulatory focus as well, is traditionally engagement with those charged with governance typically happens at the year end in the form of a presentation one day before the accounts are signed off. Now, the question which arises is, how is that sufficient? In the sense, if you had an issue one day before the audit committee or one day before the accounts are being signed off, how will that communication be meaningful for you to do it? Quite often that communication is on the same day of sign off in many cases, right? How is that meaningful enough? Is that just a tick in the box that you made a slide where you put the presentation and you said, okay, these are the matters for your attention? But how is it meaningful enough for them to decide on those items? How did you manage that? Is also a question which regulators are now asking. So therefore, when we say engage or speak with those charged with governance, it's not sufficient for us to do that on the date of sign off or one day before the date of sign off. It has to be periodic, right? It has to be, for example, if you are able to demonstrate that you've been speaking with those charged with governance all through the year, or at least 4 or 5 times through the year, and you've been communicating matters which have come across up to that point, they've got some point of view. If you have come across on a major item between the last interaction and the sign off date, it's important that at least you do a interaction in a smaller group or communicate to them of the matter so that they are able to demonstrate that they have applied their mind, they have agreed and so on. See, the whole thing is around being able to demonstrate that those charged with governance also understood their responsibility and executed their responsibility in context of these matters. Someone who's an independent director could turn around and say, I was told by the auditor in the morning of the results, how do you expect me to even take a decision on this or apply my mind to this? So therefore, it's extremely important from our standpoint to protect ourselves that if there are any major matters, we are able to communicate to those charged with governance either 2-3 days in advance so that they are able to kind of see if it was not covered in our previous interaction, right? So that's an important element on it being a periodic interaction and thorough interaction, right? The other element is the various auditing standards require us to communicate many matters mandatorily to those charged with governance. Say for example, independence, whether we were independent of the company, that is required to be communicated. We are required to communicate whether there was any fraud, or if there was no fraud, we must put that fact out. We have to communicate whether we have received a representation letter on time. We are required to communicate whether our opinion is a clean opinion or a qualified, modified opinion. Do we have any emphasis of matters? We are required to communicate whether what were the significant areas of judgment and estimates for their consideration. We must be mindful and thought through whether we are capturing all the mandatory areas of communication with those charged with governance, because those are the minimum items which we are expected to communicate, and therefore we must go through the various auditing standards and pick up the minimum items to be communicated and ensure that we are capturing that, right? The important thing is, quite often when we communicate something to those charged with governance, we feel our responsibility has ended, that we have told them, now it's their problem. The regulators do not see it that way. The regulators still require you to take responsibility of the matters and opinion. Communicating to those charged with governance is not a solution for an issue which you are not able to resolve. It is you are only informing them about their responsibility, which is that they have to get their accounts right. But our responsibility of issuing an opinion which is appropriate still lies with us. So there's a very thin line of difference between or very important this thing, that you are not absolved of your responsibility just by communicating of an issue to those charged with governance. It's our responsibility to communicate because we have to enable them to perform their role. It's our obligation to communicate to them because ultimately they are responsible for financial statements, so they should take the decision. But if we believe something is incorrect, if we believe something does not have any basis, or we have not received evidence, that should still reflect in our opinion. By communicating to those charged with governance, the problem does not go away. So therefore, that also is a very important element which you should be mindful of, right? And we also spoke of judgments and estimates in terms of all important areas of judgments and estimates have to be communicated. If there were any changes in the basis of how the judgments and estimates were formed, those have to be communicated. If there's any sensitivity or significance of those judgments and estimates in the context of, say, debt covenants, etc., those also have to be called out. The more you detailed your conversation with those charged with governances around judgments and estimates is, the better it is. Because it's an important area. Like for example, if I'm auditing a bank or an NBFC more specifically, say provisions either under RBI regulations or ECL is an extremely important lever in terms of how the profit works out, right? And there are, especially in ECL, much more judgments and estimates which are involved. Now, are you able to capture that in a manner and communicate to those charged with governance so that they are able to understand that clearly? They're able to clearly understand what positions were taken by management which were judgmental, right? Which had some rationale, but you would like them to validate it. It's important that we are able to communicate that to those charged with governance on a timely basis. And this is where the question of continuous engagement comes in, right? If you communicated all these judgments and estimates one day before or the day of the signing, it is practically they can't do anything about it rather than listen and just leave it. But if you are able to finalize this and get the communication across to them 3 months before, then you are able to demonstrate that they have also applied their mind, they have also confirmed that they are fine with it. You must get that documented, of course. So it's an important element of our communication with those charged with governance that we are able to communicate all judgments and estimates to them, right? Last but not the least, typically when I say those charged with governance, of course, if I had a meeting with the MD one-on-one, meeting minutes which we spoke of in audit documentation comes in, right? But if we are doing a meeting with the board, or we are doing a meeting with the audit committee, we rely on the company secretary to prepare minutes of the meeting, right? Now, can anyone tell me what type of meeting minutes the company secretary records for our interaction with those charged with governance? Anyone? Please, anyone, some participation. I'll also get a break. Auditors made a presentation and their report for the year ended so and so, one line, right? Whereas what we are actually communicating to those charged with governance are a whole host of things. We are communicating our scope. We are communicating our materiality. We would have communicated audit plan earlier, hopefully, and then any changes from the audit plan we are communicating now. We are communicating key matters discussed with management, key issues, right? Any important judgment and estimate. We are communicating our independence. But all we have as evidence is one line that auditors presented their audit report for the year, not even presentation, audit report for the year ended 24-25. Now the question is, if an external agency comes in and wants to see what did you discuss with those charged with governance, what do you have? You have one line in the meeting minutes. You may have a presentation which you would have prepared, which is also extremely cryptic. It has single bullets for each item, which does not explain everything. We explain that orally. Now, how will anyone evidence what discussion you had with those charged with governance if it's neither there in the slides on your file nor it's there in the meeting minutes? So this is an area where we are getting that wrong completely, right? One, on timeliness of communication. Are we doing it on a periodic basis? And what we are discussing, how do you capture? So therefore, again, this is an area where I think 2 or 3 things are important. One, we must encourage the company secretaries to have more detailed minutes. We do not control them, so therefore to that extent we can try, but ultimately it's down to them. But irrespective, we as auditors must have detailed minutes of what we presented in the audit committee or in the board meeting, and we must send it to the company secretary as a summary saying this is what we've discussed. Remember, ultimately what we do to, as part of the audit, many times boils down to the last presentation. That's a very important deliverable for us. Now, if we are not able to demonstrate to a third party, a regulator, especially in context of an issue which has come up, that we did pick this up, we did highlight to them, and this was the understanding we had. And say independent director says, I was never told by the auditor. What evidence will you have, right? So the only evidence which we can have is a detailed minutes which we prepare if the company secretary is not willing to put it in his or her minutes, and send it capturing not only the slides but much more detailed minutes of what you really explained. Otherwise, the whole effort of your audit goes away without any evidence.
One emerging practice is that when you prepare detailed minutes yourselves, it's your documentation. Nobody has validated it.
Right.
So one emerging practice is that you prepare a detailed audit committee report. You circulate that officially in advance.
Right.
And that is a record of what you are communicating, not just the 260 letter, not just your slides, but in sufficient appropriate details. An audit committee report, and that's a very good evidence.
That should also should work.
You have circulated it officially, and that's what you can take on.
Yeah, yeah. And also I think another element would be that you circulated something, but then there would be a discussion, because quite often you may have presented, but you would also get their views, which will be oral. But then as a supplement, we must capture that and at least send it to company secretary and ensure that you are able to do that. I think this is an area where we must think of it as one of the most critical elements of our audit, and how we can strengthen the documentation around that. And the practice, the way it has evolved historically, is that just that we do that slide where our language is also looked at by management. They have some requests, we have some things, and we have cryptic language all over. We are much more free when we speak in the audit committee, and we get responses as well. But where is that captured in our documentation? Nowhere. So that exposes us much more to a problem later, because we may have done what we were supposed to do, but we've not actually been able to demonstrate that. And on top of it, our interaction is only one all over year, or 4. If you're a listed company, you may have done 3 quarters and this thing. But how have you demonstrated that there was continuous engagement around various elements of the audit? What discussions you had? That's also missing. So if you think about it from a regulator standpoint, I can see one slide which you spoke at the end of the year, that too on the date of the financial statements, where you communicated some matters in a very cryptic way. I don't know what you guys discussed. The company secretary says auditors presented an audit report. What comfort can a third party or a regulator get around the process which was followed? So that is a very important element of what we are expected to do, and we must focus on the documentation around this as well. Any other questions or points of view? Yeah. RBI, I think even in 21 also, when I was auditing a NBFC, came and told them that your level of documentation in your meeting minutes is very poor. You are not capturing the discussion. You are just saying what was the matter, what was the decision. But what were the deliberations? Are you able to capture that properly? Was the feedback which RBI gave the NBFC, saying, and RBI has been much more proactive in this area. Correct. And that was not only in context of auditor discussions. It was a more broader comment. Unfortunately, in case of other entities which are not regulated, we don't have a regulator who goes and inspects minutes unless there's an issue. Whereas RBI has the process of inspecting, and you're right, RBI has been very focused on the quality of documentation maintained in the meeting minutes. But of course, yeah, but never.
Maybe this is an area of collaboration between ICAI and ICSI. Company secretaries, they all are trained under ICSI.
Yeah.
And this is the fundamental of how you document minutes.
Yeah.
And given there's such an important focus area for the regulators, I think it's high time
Yeah, we should consider. But even if we don't do it at an institute level, I think again building a relationship with the company secretary and explaining to them the context and importance of what that final presentation is, and explaining to them why detailed minutes are required may also help.
No, no, absolutely, that would help. But if the push comes from the top,
Of course,
at
of
the
course,
top, that would actually do a lot of things.
of course.
And, we know that NFRA, for example, is going and engaging the company management and those charged with governance on accounting matters.
Yes,
Right? It's a very welcome change.
yes,
So similarly, if something is there from the regulator's perspective,
absolutely.
that we expect you, just as we have a documentation standard, there is a secretarial standard. For
Right, right.
if they are falling short over there, they are falling short.
Yeah,
But yes, to your point, we have to get our bit of work done.
absolutely.
At the end of the day, we want to safeguard our interests as well.
Exactly,
So we should do what we have to.
exactly. Yeah, anyone else has any comments or questions? Ideally, sir, but sometimes the hesitation is that um, video recordings will then be, if you keep it as is in the file, then it's a problem of how do you archive and what all you discuss and so on. But we should have evidence. I think the video recording is the most ideal kind of thing, but yeah. The only question is, will the company be able to cut only your portion and give it to you for your records, because they will not give you the whole thing for your records. Those kind of questions would come up. But ideally the recording is the best thing, but if not, then the minutes are the next best alternative. Right. Other than this, there was one more thing which we had to cover with all of you, is the whole question of what type of documentation do we maintain when, say, a NFRA review happens, right? I think Lamya must have explained that typically NFRA's reviews are of two broad types. One is investigative, which typically is triggered by any particular event or a corporate failure and so on. And the other is a periodic review of the firms in terms of what processes they have, etc. So the investigative one, of course, is a separate thing we don't have to get into. But now, as you are aware, NFRA has begun a process of reviewing the all the elements of what an audit firm should have in terms of processes, documentations, etc. They did some review of 4 or 5 firms previously for the period 21, FY21 and 22. For FY23, I think they are doing for 6 firms. And what we read in the press also, I think there was an official statement that they are expecting to do it for 30 firms in the next year. Now, typically what they would do is they would come to the firm and understand everything relating to the audit, which would mean not only the files relating to specific audits, but the processes which the firm has in relation to the overall audit. So when I say processes, it also means, for example, the process around client acceptance and engagement acceptance. What were the considerations you had before accepting a client? Did you do a risk assessment? Did you understand the risks? Did you understand any other process? Was there a process of concurrence by another partner of whether this should be accepted or not accepted? That is one element. What was the process of monitoring bandwidth of the partner signing the accounts? How many audits he or she is doing? Do they have enough time to execute all these audits? Similarly, of the staff, like typically if you have a large team, you will have a person who is responsible as a manager or senior manager who is responsible for the wider team. How many audits he or she is doing? How are you monitoring their bandwidth? Are you allowing them sufficient time to conduct those audits, right? And then the team below. So therefore, that is another element they would focus. I'm just giving you examples of the breadth. There will be many other items, but they focus on that. how do you monitor independence from your audit clients, right? What processes do you have? How do you ensure that none of the other partners in your firm or is not taking up any other non-audit work with that same company where you are doing audit work? Is there a process of approval? Is there a process of evaluation? Like there are some services which are permitted under Companies Act for audit clients, and say you fall in that category. But how did your firm ensure that those categories were met, criteria were met? What was the evaluation? How did you document that? Those were also important elements which they looked at. Similarly, did you have a process of having a concurring partner, a second partner who is reviewing some of the work which you have done? What was their involvement, involvement in critical decisions? How did they manage? How did you manage that process? That is another element which they look at. Of course, then they also look at sample files where they look at how was independence documented, what were the key assertions, were there any challenges or not in those as well. So it's a very extensive review, somewhat similar to what we've experienced in peer reviews, but the level of rigor and skepticism is much more, possibly especially skepticism in terms of why should you not have that. In fact, it's not only to these items, but I'll tell you, they also focus on what type of technology are you using in your audits, right? If you're using technology, how have you ensured that this is the right technology, it's giving you the right output? Just that, say for example, quite often when you're auditing Black-Scholes model for ESOP, there are templates which are available on the internet, right? And someone uses it and does it, and we are satisfied with it. The question they ask is, how do you know that template is right? Which is a valid question, right? But it's our team members may think, so simple, I'll go and do it on the internet and I'll validate it. So any use of technology also they would come and question, saying, how did you get it right? L&D, their focus is also, what do you do for L&D? How do you keep your teams informed of new updates? How do you train them? They focus on all aspects, actually much more qualitative, much more focused really on how do you ensure audit quality at the core. It's not a focus only on finding faults in the file, but looking at as a firm, are you set up to geared up to do audits? So therefore, I think that's also a very important element for us to prepare for, like as they become larger in size, as they have gone through some of the large firms, and then they will start looking at covering more and more firms. It is important for us to kind of focus on all elements of doing an audit business. Ultimately, we are doing audit as a profession. We need to have processes and controls around various elements of audit, not only the technology which we use to execute an audit, but technology or processes around accepting clients, technology process around L&D, technology and process around managing bandwidth, learning and development for the teams. Even for partners, they want to know, how did you as partner ensure that you are aware or you are keeping yourself abreast of all the developments. So therefore, that is a very detailed review. And if, for example, you are using any tools or technologies, they want to get to the bottom of it. How did you do it? What was the process you followed? What was the testing you did before you accepted the tool? Some of those are also very important, which we must, as a process, even though not on the file, they would like to understand and capture that. So that's also a very important element of what they capture in terms of their review. Any comments, any questions on that? Sir, audit software, it's a very, I'm aware, what I had heard was there were certain agencies which were developing audit software which they would allow for license to all firms, but I am not sure. I think it has to go through the rigor of some tests and reviews. I think that's the only practical solution. I don't think it's practical for each firm to develop its own software and then use it. It becomes very expensive and so on. But you are right that a lot of the things we've spoken of today, especially around documentation, the basic hygiene of cross-referencing and all, we will struggle as we go to bigger and bigger companies to maintain all of that manually or even on an Excel file and so on. We need to have proper documentation to support us, and that will possibly be achieved only through a minimum software which captures all these requirements. So therefore all firms will need to think about how they can get it. It could be through licensing from third parties, it could be from acquiring it, it could be by developing themselves, but there has to be a proper software. The ability to for us to document things on manually, on either on paper or on a collection of Excel files which I store in some folder somewhere, I think that is going away. I don't think we can sustain that as a profession for long. We will soon, especially the way we are growing as a country, I think the size of the size and complexity of companies is also increasing. We will find it very, very difficult, say 10 years from now, to do anything which are without a software. So that is something all firms, proprietor firms or partnership firms, have to think about in advance as to how they will achieve that. And this will also require a considered period of evaluation. It will not be like I go and get a software today. Even if I have to license, I have to evaluate it, I have to test it. It may be a process of 6 months, 1 year, 2 years possibly, before you take a decision, because it will also be high cost decision. So therefore I think that's very critical also as an element of what a regulator would consider as minimum basis for you to document. Especially we have in India, the listed companies, large firms audit only a very small number of listed companies. Majority of the listed companies is audited is spread out. If you think about countries like US or UK, you may have a concentrated 200, 250 firms which may be auditing their listed companies. We have much more. And therefore, once we are doing listed companies, then it is natural that the regulator will start looking at firms who are auditing listed companies. Right? And similarly for peer reviews, I'm sure many of you have gone through peer reviews. The focus is similar. The focus is on evaluating and thinking about whether that firm is geared up for doing an audit. It again is an end-to-end process which starts from client acceptance, independence evaluation, auditing process, how do you deal with resignations, how do you deal with your reviews, how do you ensure allocation happens of work to partners, how do you ensure key decisions are documented. Also, the other important thing I missed talking about when NFRA looks at it, NFRA also looks at how is the governance structure of the audit firm. Who like similar to we talk of those charged with governance for clients, they also focus on those charged with governance for the firms. And they ask questions around who's looking at which clients we should serve, who's looking at how many clients we should take up, who's looking at, they're also looking at are you going at very low fees, because then there will be pressure for you to cut efforts and undercut the quality of your audit. So some of those questions are really challenging. I think we will evolve as a profession over time. We may not have thought about it. We may not have thought about it as much from an audit quality standpoint. But when NFRA and ICAI also now thinks about audit quality, ICAI had also put out a document for audit quality where it had spoken of all these elements. In fact, in the UK, now regulators have said that you need to have a minimum level of pricing, and the audit committees are getting into pricing and saying, no, you must pay more. You can't, are you satisfied with the level of fees which you are getting for you to do a quality audit? I think if not in the next 5-10 years, but I think 10-15 years certainly we will also get there. But we also as firms and professionals have to be very conscious of this. And increasingly with NFRA reviews going down that path, I would not be surprised if ICAI's peer reviews also go down that path and much more challenging, so that all firms also get prepared for the eventual NFRA review, because that is an important element for us to think about. I think those were the items I had. If any other questions, if on any topic you would like, we can discuss that, else we can wrap up.
Terms of engagement, you had one topic.
Yeah. So I thought about it, you're right. The terms of engagement, typically, there is a separate auditing standard. There are some most of the audits we do, if you think about statutory audits, the scope of work is really standard. It is prescribed in law. The format of the engagement letter is also kind of prescribed in the auditing standard itself, which we typically use. I think the only area which we need to be careful on terms with what are the terms of engagement is that is the right level of authority informed in context of the terms, which would typically be those charged with governance. If you recall, even in management representation letters, there is a big debate as to those charged with governance should give you the management representation letter rather than the CFO. Similarly, the engagement letter should also be copied to the audit committee so that they are aware, and the board so that they are aware of it. If you're doing outside of statutory audits where the scope of work is not very clear, say you're doing a special purpose audit or an AUP, then the terms, even the scope becomes very critical for you to define properly. The scope has to be defined properly. You must agree, you must have clarity, and there are elements which the auditing standards talks of which you be very clear. Like for example, since we are talking of other engagements, you know the guidance note on certificates, right? It talks of formats which are not consistent with the guidance note. Say in context of certain situations or certain regulators, you are required to issue a certificate which is not consistent with the guidance note. Even there, the guidance note issued by ICI says, if you are stuck with this situation, you first evaluate whether you can stick to the guidance note. If you can't, you must reflect whether you should continue on this engagement or should you resign, right? So therefore, I think the important element is that whenever we are doing other than statutory audits, the terms of engagement become very important. Ensure that the engagement letter captures the scope of work. But in context of statutory audit, it is not as complex. It's a standard thing. We have formats available. We must ensure we capture IFC, etc. properly if we are doing listed entities or unlisted entities covered by IFC. But outside of that, nothing on terms of engagement. Thank you for the question. Okay.
Thank you so much, Ajit. It was really enlightening, and he has very capably taken the challenge which the speaker has for a session after a delicious lunch. I think he has very clearly made the documentation, its importance, and not only the importance we all are aware importance, but he given the very many tips how to maintain that. Definitely, we'll all be benefited with the these takeaways given by him. For the time devoted, I propose hearty vote of thanks to the today's speaker, C. Ajit, and request all of you to carry. We have our own chairman sir. We have our own chairman with us. I request chairman sir and also Central Council member Rajkumar Adukia sir is there. Saurabh Ajmera sir, regional council member. Ketan bhai is already with us. Sir, yes, please sir, come on. And also request Rajkumar Adukia sir to address on this occasion.
Yeah. First we will have a photo. SA 500 audit evidence. Thank you. Till the photographer comes. Friends, there are two subjects where client do not pay us. One is compliance of Chartered Accountants Act 1949, and another is a compliance of standards on auditing. So standards on auditing, they are like defense tools. When there is an attack by NFRA, by other regulators like Economic Offence Wing, DRI, CBI, bank, कि you are negligent. Auditee or a regulator of auditee takes a stand. So this time, our tools, our documentation. See, nowadays packaging matters a lot. When we give a gift may be very precious. But if it is not packaged properly, sir, now photographer is there. So first we will have SA 500. अच्छा, केतन जी saying कि let me complete. सर आप हाँ फोटो लीजिए मेरा और मैं बोलता सूरत. And I would like to recognize CA Ramesh Prabhu, encyclopedia on real estate matters, cooperative matters, RERA matters. He is one person from whom I learned cooperative, RERA, from day one or maybe 1 or 2 years after his practice. He is doing, and that is the way, like Swami Vivekananda was known for religion, Mahatma Gandhi for freedom. Each one of us, we should find out what is the area which we can do 24 hours or 15 hours a day. So I found out my interest is to talk to members, talk to students. So I do not get fatigued with any number of terms in the Central Council. So I am in 7th term. I will go for another 2 terms because I am eligible for another 2 terms. So, okay. Then I have a larger goal to be the President of India. So my request to each one of you is, find out your passion. There is a book by Simon Sinek. Each one of us, we must read. Start with why. What is my why to become a chartered accountant? What is my why if I am in corporate? What is my why? How I can take the organization to a sky height? And everything should be done as a fun, as an entertainment. If I don't like GST compliances, I should ask myself, after 20 years also I can switch over to something. I wish to be a mentor of, not mentor, mastermind of each one of us. There is another must-read book called Think and Grow Rich. This book is written by Napoleon Hill in 1930, and this person did research for 25 years. He was paid for the research by Andrew Carnegie, the richest person in USA. This person has given 13 principles of success. Anything what we want to achieve. I have made a monomic. Like my mission is every CA student must pass in the first attempt. This year I am heading Board of Studies. So D Faki, sometime instead of eating we take Faki. D Faki, PDP, MEM, BS. D is a desire. It should be burning desire to do something. Faki, faith, auto-suggestion, specialized knowledge, number 1 in the world. Imagination, planning, organized, decision,